He taps the microphone, smiles, and announces my replacement while my wedding ring tightens. The sound jumps a soft pop of feedback, and the wireless mic settles into his hand like it belongs there. Like this is routine. Like I am not standing under the same clean lights. I helped schedule watching 8 years compress into a sentence that keeps moving without me. Applause starts in pockets, spreads, becomes polite, and then enthusiastic, and I count breaths instead of faces, because counting faces would break the control I have practiced for years. Chairs scrape, programs fold, someone coughs. The stage lights burn warm, too warm, and I feel the heat on my cheeks, as if it's my fault the room is bright. I straighten my blazer by reflex and hold my shoulders still because stillness reads as competence even when the floor tilts. He keeps smiling. The mic does its job. My name is not said. The word transition floats clean and harmless, and the crowd nods like they understand what it costs. I glance at the stage edge where the cable disappears and think about how many times I checked connections so nothing would fail in front of clients. How many times I solved problems quietly so the show would look effortless. A countdown ticks in my head, not minutes, not seconds, just the closing window before the room moves on without me, and I know if I speak now, the noise will swallow it and call it emotion. I watch my boss's mouth form practiced syllables, and I note the cadence, because cadence is how authority hides intention. He gestures once an open palm, and the light catches his watch. People lean forward. Phones lift slightly, not enough to be rude enough to remember later. The mic hums steady now, and I feel the vibration through the air, more than through my bones, a reminder that amplification changes truth without touching it. I keep my hands at my sides. I keep my chin level. My ring presses into my finger, a thin ache that sharpens as I tighten my fist, and release it tighten, and release a small action to anchor the bigger one I'm refusing. The room smells like fresh print and coffee. The carpet muffles steps. The stage lights bleach faces into clarity, and clarity is never neutral. In that light, I see the woman he points to step forward with the confidence of someone who is told in advance where to stand. She takes the space I used to manage the space I cleared, and the applause swells again because people clap for motion, not context. A breath line catches me. The lights glare white. The mic's low hiss fills the air, and I swallow the urge to correct the record because the object in his hand decides what gets heard. I catalog details instead. Who claps first? Who hesitates? Who avoids my eyes? I notice the exit doors at the back and the way the handles gleam, and I think about access and timing, because that's what keeps events safe. My boss finishes the sentence. The applause peaks. He steps back half a pace, ceding the floor like a courtesy, and the woman smiles with a composure that looks earned if you don't know the route she took. I feel my pulse in my throat, and I let it be there without chasing it, because chasing turns into a scene, and scenes belong to stages, not to the people they erase. I tell myself this is not the moment. The countdown tightens, the program moves, the mic passes hands, the lights stay bright. I keep my posture neutral, and my expression unreadable, because neutrality buys time, and time is the only currency left to me right now. Someone behind me whispers my name and stops. Someone else squeezes my elbow and releases it quickly, like contact itself is evidence. I nod once. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that I'm still present. My boss clears his throat and gestures toward the next slide that isn't for me. The woman adjusts her stance and looks out at the crowd as if she's always been here. I feel the ring again, the metal warming against my skin, and I loosen my hand because pain narrows options, and I need them wide. A short sentence lands in my head and stays there. This was planned. Another follows. It was planned to look clean. The lights don't flicker. The mic doesn't fail. The applause doesn't falter. The show goes on because it was built to. I step back a fraction, so I'm not in the camera's line, a micro move that saves me from being framed as reaction, and I breathe through my nose until the urge to interrupt drains away. My boss thanks the room. The mic catches every word. He thanks the team. The word team expands to include everyone but me, and I let it pass because fighting language in public is like fighting gravity. It looks dramatic and changes nothing. I think about the window that is closing the few beats before the narrative locks, and I decide not to spend them begging for space. I decide to spend them observing. Who holds the mic? Who controls the lights? Who knew where to stand? Who didn't look surprised? The ring presses again, and this time I slide it a millimeter, a quiet adjustment that reminds me I can still act without being seen. The applause tapers. The program advances. People settle. My boss turns away from me, already moving on, and that movement tells me more than the words did. The room applauds, the mic stays warm, and I understand the stage was never neutral. I'm Laura Mitchell, 39, a senior operations manager from Chicago, Illinois. The lanyard badge rests flat against my chest as I walk the familiar corridor, the plastic edge tapping lightly with each step, a sound I've learned to ignore, because routine depends on small noises behaving themselves. 8 years of mornings taught me where the lights warm first, which doors stick, which conference room breathes cold air too fast, and I move through it all with the calm that comes from being necessary without being visible. People nod. I nod back. The badge opens what it should open. The floor plan makes sense. Nothing feels broken yet. I pause at my desk and straighten a stack of folders, even though they were straight yesterday, because order is how I check that the world still responds. The stage lights in the main hall glow through the glass wall, already warming for an event later today, and the brightness feels comforting, like a promise that clarity exists if you prepare enough. I hang my coat, slide my phone face down, and open my calendar, scanning for gaps that mean flexibility, and for overlaps that mean leverage. There's a meeting that moved without explanation. There's an invite missing my name. I tell myself calendars are living things and keep going. My husband texts a neutral good luck, the kind that reads supportive without details, and I type back a thumbs up I don't mean. The badge swings when I reach for coffee, and the machine hums like it always has, steady, reliable, the kind of sound you trust. In the break room, Mark Hollis stands with his back to the counter, talking softly to someone whose reflection I catch in the glass. He stops when he sees me and smiles the way people do when they're already mid-decision. "Morning, Laura," he says, "easy professional." I return it and ask about load-in times. He answers without looking at the schedule on his tablet, and that flicker matters because he usually checks. I file it away. He mentions a transition meeting later, casual like weather. I nod and say I'll prep the team because that's what I do when information arrives incomplete. The badge taps again when I leave a soft reminder of access earned over time. At my desk, I run through checklists and make small adjustments that keep other people's surprises from becoming public. I reroute a delivery. I confirm seating counts. I approve a vendor change that should have crossed my desk yesterday. The work still flows through me, even if the edges feel fuzzy. A colleague lingers, opens her mouth, closes it, and finally asks if I'm okay. I tell her I'm fine, and mean that I am functional, which is the currency here. She nods too fast and leaves. The stage lights brighten a notch across the hall, and I glance up instinctively, gauging spill and glare, thinking about sight lines and shadows, because visibility can either protect or expose, depending on who controls it. A breath line steadies me. The hum of the building settles. The badge presses cool against my sternum, and I choose not to chase the questions yet, because timing matters more than certainty. I open the shared drive and notice my permissions look thinner than they did last week. A folder grayed out, another asking for approval I never needed before. I refresh. Same result. I don't react. Reaction teaches people where you're vulnerable. I send a polite note to ITCC, no one, and keep moving. Mark passes by again with Rachel Evans at his side, her posture confident, her badge new and still stiff, and they're talking about deliverables I used to own. He introduces her as if it's overdue. She shakes my hand and thanks me for setting things up, a phrase that lands heavier than intended. I smile and welcome her, because welcome is a habit I don't break in public. The day advances. The badge opens doors but not conversations. I catch my reflections in the glass and adjust my blazer knot vanity alignment. When the lights in the hall reach full brightness, I note how faces change under them, how truth feels different when nothing can hide. I check my watch without looking at the time, and think about access, about who decides when a door latches and when it swings. There's a sense, quiet but persistent, that something is being arranged just out of view, and arrangements leave traces if you know where to look. I pack my bag for the evening event and pause with the badge in my hand, feeling its weight, remembering when it first opened anything at all. The corridor smells like cleaner and warm electronics. I straighten the lanyard and step back into motion, telling myself preparation has always been my protection, and if that's changing, I'll know soon enough. The lights stay warm, the badge still opens doors, and I walk forward anyway. I carried the clipboard with the incident log tucked against my ribs like a habit, not a shield, because habits pass unnoticed and shields invite questions, and that morning I needed to move without either. The hallway outside operations smelled faintly of toner and warm plastic, and I walked it the way I always had, eyes forward steps, measured badge swinging in a predictable arc while the clipboard stayed still. People looked up when I passed, then looked away, a beat too fast, a pattern subtle enough to deny and consistent enough to count. In the back office, the log lay open where I'd left it. My handwriting clean, dates replaced by shifts and notes trimmed to essentials, the way we're trained to keep records readable when pressure blurs details. I scanned entries I knew by memory and noticed where language softened without reason, where verbs lost edges, where accountability drifted into passive phrasing. Someone had edited after the fact and tried to make it sound like routine. I didn't comment. I turned a page. The room hummed. The copier clicked. I noted who didn't speak when I entered, who pretended to be busy without actually touching anything. I asked a simple question about vendor access, the kind that usually earns a quick answer, and the answer came half a second late, eyes flicking to the doorway before returning to me. Another question about load-in timing drew a nod without confirmation, a verbal yes that didn't carry commitment. I wrote nothing down. Writing makes people defensive. I held the clipboard steady and listened for what wasn't said, for the pauses that stretch when someone decides whether to tell you the truth or tell you what they've been told to tell you. The incident log became less about incidents and more about the space between entries, the gaps where something should have been recorded and wasn't. A coordinator cleared his throat and mentioned a new process without naming it. I asked who approved it. He smiled and said it was handled. I thanked him and moved on because gratitude keeps doors open longer than confrontation. In the corridor, I passed Mark Hollis and Rachel Evans, mid-conversation, their heads angled together in a way that signals alignment, not collaboration. They paused when they saw me, the pause too clean to be spontaneous. Mark asked if everything was set for the evening. I said yes because it was, and because my work had never been the problem. Rachel added that she was looping in with ops to learn the flow. The phrase landed like a courtesy and felt like a claim. I nodded and adjusted the clipboard under my arm, a small motion that kept my hands busy and my face neutral. When they walked away, they didn't lower their voices, but they did shorten sentences another tell. I didn't follow. Following turns curiosity into spectacle. Back at my desk, I cross-checked the log against my own mental map of the week. The inconsistencies didn't shout. They whispered. A delivery rerouted without the usual sign-off, a seating change that skipped my approval, a safety check logged as complete before it happened. None of it catastrophic on its own. Together it formed a shape I recognized from other people's crises, the quiet removal of friction, so movement looks natural later. I flipped the clipboard closed and felt the slight resistance of the metal clip, the familiar pressure that steadies paper and sometimes people. I watched the bullpen from the corner of my eye and saw two colleagues exchange a look when my phone buzzed, then look away when I didn't react. The buzz was a calendar reminder that no longer included me as host. I silenced it without opening the app. A breath line cut through the noise. The fluorescent light stayed flat and honest. The low murmur of keyboards filled the room, and I chose to slow my breathing because control lives there when certainty doesn't, and the clipboard's cool edge grounded me in what could still be verified. I stood and asked the room if anyone had seen the updated ops memo. Silence answered first, then a chorus of, "I'll check," which told me everything about who had already checked and been told not to answer. I smiled, thanked them, and walked the long way to storage, counting steps, watching reflections in glass, noting who followed with their eyes and who didn't. In storage, a junior tech avoided meeting my gaze while explaining a change in access badges. He spoke too quickly and ended with a joke that didn't land. I laughed anyway and asked him to email the details. He promised to. He didn't. When I returned to the log, I noticed a new entry added in a different hand, the ink slightly heavier, the phrasing careful. It described a routine adjustment that had in fact shifted authority. I didn't cross it out. I initialed next to it, "Not agreement, acknowledgement," and the initial felt like a pin placed on a map. I remembered times I'd coached staff to document behavior without judgment, to let patterns speak. The advice had always been for them. Today it applied to me. I tucked the clipboard under my arm again and walked past HR without stopping past Mark's office, where the door was closed, but voices leaked past Rachel's desk, where a new notebook lay open, as if it had always belonged there. I made a note to myself, not on paper, not on a device, but as a rule, don't correct the story yet. Let it commit itself to record. I watched as small courtesies were withheld, as questions were redirected, as responsibility slid sideways without explanation. Each instance alone was deniable. Together they were choreography. The clipboard grew heavier with meaning, not weight, and I adjusted my grip because meaning requires care if you don't want to drop it in front of witnesses. I sent a neutral follow-up to IT about permissions and received an automated reply. I forwarded it to myself and closed the app. By mid-afternoon, the room felt different, tighter, as if the air had been redistributed. People moved around me rather than with me. Someone asked Rachel for approval on a decision that used to be mine, and apologized to me afterward, an apology shaped like insurance. I accepted it and said nothing. Silence preserves options. I returned the clipboard to its hook and paused, then took it back down, deciding I wanted it where I could see it. I walked to the window and looked at the hall where the stage lights would burn later, imagining faces under that clarity, imagining how truth looks when it's framed as logistics. I understood then that the first fracture wasn't the announcement. It was the preparation that made the announcement look inevitable. I didn't feel anger yet. I felt focus, the kind that sharpens edges and slows time. I straightened the log one last time and placed it flat, aligned with the desk, because alignment makes later comparisons easier. The clipboard told me enough without saying anything, and I stopped pretending this was accidental. The room had already filled when I stepped into the hall, and the projector remote lay cool and light in my palm, a small baton that decided what existed on the screen and what did not, and I took my place near the aisle, because proximity reads as confidence even when you're not invited to speak. Rows of chairs faced the stage in tidy alignment, seat row B filling fast with managers, who liked being seen agreeing, and the lights burned bright enough to flatten expressions into something legible from a distance. I checked sightlines out of habit, noted where phones could lift without blocking views, and watched the first slide glow to life with an agenda that felt thinner than it should have. Mark Hollis stood center stage, smiling with that practiced ease that turns announcements into inevitabilities, and Rachel Evans hovered half a step back, hands folded, posture rehearsed. Applause came on cue. I didn't clap. I held the remote loosely and felt its smooth edge press against my thumb, a reminder that control often sits with whoever touches the tool last. Mark spoke about growth and alignment, about the need to streamline ownership phrases designed to sound neutral in rooms like this, and I watched faces instead of listening, counting the nods marking who leaned forward and who crossed their arms. When the slide advanced, my old role title appeared smaller than it used to, a quiet demotion disguised as formatting, and a murmur rippled through seat row B as people compared the screen to memory. A woman 2 seats in from the aisle glanced back at me, then forward again, and the glance mattered because it carried recognition before discretion kicked in. I felt the remote warm as the projector hummed, and I waited because waiting forces others to reveal their timing. Mark gestured with an open hand, a signal, and the next slide landed with Rachel's name in bold, where mine used to sit, the letters clean and unapologetic. Applause broke out faster this time. Relief applause, the kind that greets decisions already made. I stayed still. The remote didn't move. Mark kept talking, filling space with assurances, and I noticed phones lifting higher now, not to record me, but to capture the moment that would be retold as progress. Someone whispered behind me too loud, "Isn't that her job?" And the whisper spread like a question, passed hand to hand. A manager in seat row B leaned toward his neighbor and pointed at the screen, then at me, then stopped when he realized I could see him. I met his eyes and nodded once, a courtesy that froze him in place. Mark thanked the team again, and Rachel stepped forward as if drawn by the light, her smile steady, her chin lifted just enough to suggest readiness rather than hunger. The room read her as capable, because rooms like this prefer narratives that resolve quickly. A breath line settled me. The projector fan whirred steadily. The bright light erased shadows, and I chose to hold my ground, because movement would frame me as reaction, and reaction invites interpretation I couldn't afford. I glanced at the exit doors and clocked how quickly security could clear a path if needed a reflex. I didn't switch off, and I noticed Tom Reynolds near the sidewall earpiece in scanning the crowd with the calm of someone who managed flow rather than opinion. Our eyes met for a beat, and he gave the smallest nod, not allegiance acknowledgement, and that mattered because it placed a witness in the room who knew what normal looked like. Mark finished the sentence that ended my tenure without naming it, and the applause peaked again, a sound that felt physical as it pushed air against my ribs. I didn't breathe until it dipped. When the Q&A opened, a hand went up in seat row B, and the question came out careful and public: how would the transition affect ongoing commitments I'd been overseeing? Mark answered without looking at me, deflecting with timelines and support language, and the deflection landed flat, because the room had already seen the slide. Another hand rose, then another question stacking into a shape that suggested discomfort more than curiosity. I kept the remote steady and didn't advance the deck when Mark paused, forcing him to ask for the next slide, forcing the request to be audible. I pressed the button, then just once, and the slide changed the click, crisp, a small sound that drew attention because it punctured his rhythm. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Rachel's smile tightened. Mark recovered and thanked me reflexively, the old habit surfacing before he could stop it, and a few heads turned sharply at the mistake. That was when a voice from seat row B said, "She's the one who built this, not loud, not confrontational, just factual," and the fact carried weight, because it came from the audience, not the stage. A few people nodded. Phones lifted again. Tom shifted his stance, angling his body to keep the aisle clear, and I noted it without looking at him, because coordination works best when it's not performed. Mark acknowledged the comment with a brief nod and moved on, but the move felt rushed, like a door closed too quickly. Rachel thanked the speaker with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I watched the room reassess the way public spaces do when a narrative stutters. I felt the remote heat against my skin and thought about how many times I'd warned teams that public clarity cuts both ways, and I let the slide deck continue as planned, because deviation would read as sabotage. The agenda marched forward. The applause softened. The questions thinned. People glanced at me and then at each other, recalibrating where to place their loyalty in real time. Mark wrapped up with a promise of support and transparency, and the word transparency landed differently now that the projector light had shown what it had. He invited everyone to stay for networking, a word that loosens rooms and chairs scraped as people stood, conversations breaking into clusters that formed around power like iron filings. As the crowd shifted, a woman from seat row B approached me, lowered her voice, and said she was sorry that she hadn't known that the slide made it clear. And I thanked her and stepped aside to let traffic pass, because blocking flow creates friction that security notices. Tom passed behind me and murmured, "I saw the timing, nothing more," and that sentence mattered because it placed an operational witness to the sequence of events. I nodded without turning. Mark avoided my line of sight. Rachel accepted congratulations with practiced ease and didn't look my way at all, which told me she understood the room had changed and wanted to keep it moving. I pocketed the remote and felt its weight settle against my hip. A borrowed authority returned to me by circumstance rather than permission, and I watched the hall empty in layers, the loud first, then the quiet, then the careful. The light stayed bright, the projector cooled, the screen went blank. I stood where I was until the last cluster broke, because leaving early would have written a story I didn't want attached to my name. When I finally moved, it was toward the side aisle, not the exit, a choice that kept me visible without inviting commentary. The witnesses had seen enough to question the script, and the stage could not pretend it hadn't happened. The sealed legal envelope waited on my desk when the hall finally went quiet, its weight wrong for paper and right for consequences. The flap unbroken, the return address printed with the kind of precision that signals policy rather than conversation. I closed the door to my office and set the envelope square to the edge of the desk, because alignment steadies my hands. Then I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the building settle to vents, cycling, and distant voices thinning as people drifted back to their routines. I had learned to read silence in rooms like this, to know when it meant relief and when it meant avoidance, and this silence carried the latter a pressure that pressed inward rather than out. I cut the envelope cleanly with a letter opener I kept for vendor contracts, slid the contents free, and felt the shift as language took over where smiles had done their work earlier. The paper was warm from transit, the ink crisp, the phrasing careful, and I read it once without stopping. Then again, slower, tracing the clauses with my finger to mark where discretion had been replaced with process. It wasn't termination. It was worse in its restraint. A notice of role realignment effective immediately pending review, with references to internal procedures that existed precisely to make removal look temporary and inevitable at the same time. There were citations to policy sections I knew by number, the kind I'd helped staff understand when they were frightened, and seeing them marshaled against me felt like watching familiar tools turned edge first. I sat and let the chair settle, kept my feet flat, and scanned the margins for dates that weren't there for signatures, that were for the quiet authority of HR language that asks you not to take things personally while rearranging your life. My phone buzzed once and stopped. I didn't look. The envelope lay open like a mouth that had said its piece and would say no more. I pulled my notebook closer and wrote nothing, because writing would have made it feel smaller than it was. And instead I opened the shared HR portal on my screen, navigating to the sections cited, watching the loading icon spin longer than usual. Access still held for now. I cross-referenced the notice with the policy language and felt the hairline fracture widen as words that should have required consultation did not. As timelines that usually stretched now compressed. Someone had accelerated the process and padded it with courtesy. I checked my email and found a message time-stamped earlier in the day, polite procedural noting that documentation would follow. It had followed. The sequence mattered. The order mattered. I noted the gap between when the room applauded and when this envelope arrived, and I felt the internal break not as panic, but as a narrowing of options into a channel I could work within. A breath line slowed me. The paper rasped softly when I set it down. The desk lamp cast a clean circle of light, and I chose to keep my breathing shallow because deep breaths invite feelings that blur the edges of what needs to be precise. I remembered advising a coordinator once that when HR speaks, you listen for verbs more than adjectives, and here the verbs did the damage. Quietly reassign interim review. I stood and locked the door, not fear containment, then walked to the window and looked down at the empty hall, where the projector had cooled the chairs now stacked and anonymous. The stage lights were off, and the absence of light felt different, like relief that had come too late to help. I turned back to the desk and read the notice a third time, this time mapping who had to have signed off, whose approval would have been required to move this fast, who would benefit from the ambiguity the language preserved. I slid the notice back into the envelope and placed it atop my notebook, a stack that felt suddenly fragile. I thought about calling Mark Hollis and then didn't because phone calls create narratives you don't control. I thought about calling my husband and then didn't, because personal explanations bleed into professional records in ways that never favor you. Instead, I drafted a short acknowledgement to HR confirming receipt, requesting a copy of the supporting documentation referenced, and asking for clarification on interim authority. I read it twice, removed an adverb, added a line that placed the question on process rather than motive, and sent it without CCing anyone. The sent confirmation appeared impersonal and final, and I took a screenshot and filed it in a folder I named with a neutral label that wouldn't attract attention if seen. The envelope drew my eyes again, and I opened it to the last page where signatures lived. One name was missing. That absence mattered. Absence? It meant either haste or assumption, and both could be leveraged if documented properly. I flipped the page and noticed the header font differed slightly from standard templates, a small thing that suggested this had been assembled quickly, not pulled from a stable system. I checked the metadata and saw a creation time that post-dated the meeting by minutes, a detail that would read as coincidence to anyone not trained to look for it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief. I felt direction. My phone buzzed again this time, with a text from a colleague asking if I wanted company. I typed, "I'm okay," because okay buys you time, and time buys you clarity. I opened my calendar and saw my access thinning further, meetings disappearing like sand underwater. I resisted the urge to restore them, because restoration would leave a trace that could be framed as overreach. Instead, I forwarded calendar change notices to myself and archived them. The envelope lay open again, and I noticed a faint crease where someone had folded the paper and then smoothed it out, a sign of revision under pressure. I smoothed it again, not to erase the crease, but to remember it. A knock sounded once tentative, and then my assistant's voice asked if I needed anything. I said no, and thanked her, and the exchange felt like a boundary being tested and respected at the same time. When her footsteps faded, I allowed myself one small physical acknowledgement of what was happening. I pressed my thumb into the paper until it left a pale mark that faded slowly. Then I released it. Pressure leaves traces. Traces tell stories. I gathered the envelope, my notebook, and my phone, placed them into my bag, and zipped it closed with a sound that felt louder than it should have. Before leaving, I took photos of the notice laid flat on the desk, the envelope beside it, the timestamp visible on my screen in the background, without being emphasized, a habit I'd picked up from documenting vendor disputes. I didn't label the photos. Labels invite interpretation. I turned off the lamp, unlocked the door, and stepped into the corridor, locking behind me, because access should be acknowledged, even when it's about to be restricted. As I walked past HR, I slowed enough to glance at the frosted glass and see movement inside silhouettes that suggested activity rather than reflection. I didn't stop. I noted the time in my head without naming it, because naming fixes things too early. At the elevator, my phone chimed with a reply from HR acknowledging my message and promising a response soon. Soon is elastic. Elastic snaps if pulled correctly. In the lobby, the air felt cooler, the building's systems adjusting to evening mode, and I paused to settle my bag on my shoulder, feeling the envelope inside like a compass needle, pulling me in a direction I hadn't planned but could navigate. I thought about the public scene, about how the slide had shrunk my title, about the applause that followed, and I understood that the internal break wasn't about losing something. It was about deciding how much noise to make while getting it back. I stepped outside and let the door close behind me, the latch clicking cleanly, and the sound grounded me in the next phase of the work. The envelope didn't end my role. It narrowed the field until the rules were finally visible. The audio recorder sat between Susan Keller and me on the small conference table, its red light dark for now, a compact promise that words could be held still long enough to be weighed. And I kept my hands folded because touching it too early would have looked like hunger. Susan listened more than she spoke, a habit that steadies rooms, and when she did speak, she used verbs that didn't flinch, asking me to walk her through sequence rather than intent. I laid out the order cleanly, the slide before the notice, the applause before the paperwork, the access thinning before the justification, and she nodded once at each junction like she was checking doors in a hallway she'd walked before. The recorder stayed silent as we mapped who had authority to say what and when, where. Discretion should have slowed things, and instead accelerated, and how acceleration leaves friction marks even when language stays polite. I described the public moment without adjectives, then the envelope, then the missing signature, and Susan slid a legal pad closer without writing yet, letting the space fill with my cadence until it revealed its own breaks. She asked for the audio, not the story, and that distinction mattered because stories are shaped by memory, and audio is shaped by physics. I pulled the recorder from my bag and placed it flat, aligning it with the table edge, then pressed play, and the room filled with Mark Hollis's voice from an earlier planning call. Steady and confident, outlining a timeline that contradicted the notice's interim framing without ever saying the word. His phrasing assumed outcome. His pauses assumed agreement. The sound quality was clean enough to catch the moment when he laughed and said something would look smoother if it happened on stage, a laugh that hadn't sounded dangerous at the time, and now sat heavy in the air like a thumb on a scale. Susan didn't interrupt. She listened through eyes on the recorder, not on me, because eye contact can change testimony without meaning to. When the clip ended, she reached out and turned the device off herself, a small assertion of custody that told me she understood the weight of what we were doing. The motif echoed without needing a name. The light in the room was bright and unforgiving, the kind that shows every edge, and the recorder's casing reflected it back a small mirror, insisting that clarity doesn't care who asked for it. Susan asked when the call happened relative to the meeting and the notice, and I answered in relation to events rather than minutes, because sequence, not clocks, had been the tool used against me. She nodded again, and finally wrote a few words, only then stopped, because overnoting can obscure leverage. She explained carefully that audio like this didn't win cases on its own, but it bent processes, that it forced explanations that paperwork alone could dodge. She said we would need corroboration that placed the recording inside an operational chain, not a personal grievance, and she named Tom Reynolds, without my prompting, noting that operations managers see timing before anyone else. I felt a click of alignment that wasn't relief, just direction. A breath line steadied the room. The HVAC whispered evenly. The recorder's plastic felt cool when Susan slid it back to me, and I chose not to replay the clip, because repetition can cheapen impact even when truth doesn't fade. We talked about next steps without naming them as traps, discussed requests that would sound routine while pulling threads, and she cautioned me to keep my hands clean in public spaces, to let others carry objects that draw attention. She said authority likes to arrive after proof, not before, and that meant patience measured in actions, not days. I agreed because patience had been my profession long before it became my defense. When she asked if there was anything else, I thought of the hallway glances, the softened verbs, the creased envelope, and said there would be, and she smiled the way lawyers do when they believe you. I left her office with the recorder zipped back into my bag, and a list of requests phrased as questions, not demands, because questions compel answers that demands resist. In the lobby, I crossed paths with Tom Reynolds and slowed just enough to match his stride, neither of us stopping, because stopping creates a scene. I mentioned the projector timing from the public session, and he replied with an observation about badge access logs, casual, professional. And the exchange mattered because it linked sound to systems without making either of us look conspiratorial. He said he'd check something when he had a window, and I said thank you, without adding pressure, because pressure leaves fingerprints. We parted with a nod that said more than words could have without committing either of us to anything visible. Back at my desk, I reviewed my sent messages and forwarded Susan's follow-up questions to myself, then archived them, keeping the surface of my inbox clean. The recorder stayed in my bag, not on the desk, because objects gain attention when they don't belong. I worked through routine approvals. I still held moving paper answering questions, keeping my tone neutral, and I noticed how often people glanced at my bag, not knowing why it mattered, but sensing it did. The office lights stayed bright, unkind to secrets, and I welcomed that, because secrets thrive in corners, and corners had been used against me. When Mark passed by my door, he paused as if to speak, and then did in a hesitation that told me he felt the shift without knowing its shape. I returned his nod and went back to my screen because acknowledgement without engagement keeps balance. In the afternoon, Susan emailed a brief confirmation that she had logged the audio as received and requested additional context from operations, and the language was dry enough to sound inevitable. I forwarded it to myself and closed the app. The recorder remained silent. Silence, I was learning, could be curated. A junior coordinator stopped by with a question that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the work continuing, and I answered it fully because continuity confuses people who expect disruption. The stage lights in the hall warmed again for a rehearsal. I wasn't running, and I watched the glow spill under doors, thinking about how visibility had been used to take something from me and how it might be used to put it back where it belonged. Late in the day, Tom sent a short note confirming a discrepancy in access timing that aligned with the call on the recorder, nothing accusatory, just data, and I felt the structure tighten into something usable. I didn't reply immediately. I waited long enough for the message to become one among many, then acknowledged receipt, and thanked him because gratitude keeps allies allies. I saved the note to the same neutral folder as the screenshot and the photos of the envelope, building a stack that would look boring until it wasn't. The recorder stayed zipped. The light stayed bright. The room felt narrower in a way that made movement easier. As I packed to leave, I checked my reflection in the darkened glass and adjusted my blazer alignment again, and thought about how the public scene had taught the room to watch, and the audio would teach it to listen. I turned off my lamp and let the office fall into shadow, trusting the brightness elsewhere to do its work. The recording didn't argue my case. It bent the process until truth had somewhere to land. The venue keycard felt thinner than it used to when I slid it from my wallet, the plastic edge worn smooth by repetition, and I noticed the way doors responded now with a fractional delay, a hesitation that mirrored how people answered me in the halls. I didn't swipe yet. I stood where traffic narrowed, watching who passed and who paused, because pressure reveals roots before it reveals intentions. Tom Reynolds texted a neutral update about access windows closing earlier than planned, a system note that read like weather until you stacked it beside the audio and the notice, and I thanked him without questions, because questions pull threads too fast. In my inbox, an email thread marked EV surfaced from earlier that week, forwarded quietly, language polite and procedural, outlining a handoff that assumed Rachel Evans's authority before any review could have justified it. The phrasing mattered. The timing mattered more. I read it twice and archived it where it would stay boring until called forward. Across the floor, Mark Hollis laughed too loudly with a vendor, then caught my eye and softened it a tell he couldn't help, because control phrase under repetition. I moved toward the side entrance and finally swiped the keycard, the door unlocking with a muted click that sounded like permission, and I stepped into a corridor I'd mapped years ago, noting which lights flickered and which cameras pointed elsewhere. The card worked where it should and failed where it shouldn't, and the failure mattered because failures require explanations that become records. A coordinator stopped me to ask who approved a change request, already approved a question, shaped like confusion, and powered by instruction, and I answered with a reference to policy, rather than a person, because policies outlast people when rooms turn cold. My phone buzzed with another message from Susan Keller, brief and careful, noting that an external compliance officer had been placed on standby, pending confirmation of sequence, a phrase that felt heavier than it looked, because standby is where authority waits when it expects to move. I acknowledged receipt and kept walking, letting the corridor compress sound and intention. A breath line steadied me. The fluorescent lights hummed evenly. The keycard cooled against my palm, and I allowed myself the truth I'd been carrying to surface, because concealment had served its purpose, and now precision needed it. I had known about my husband's girlfriend for months. I had known because late nights leave patterns, and patterns leave openings, and I had chosen silence not out of fear, but out of calibration, because silence keeps variables clean. The woman stepping into my role hadn't surprised me. The stage had. Knowing that shifted the math, not the feeling. I didn't share it with Susan yet. I didn't need to. The evidence didn't care about motive-only sequence, and sequence was tightening into something with edges. I returned to my desk and found another EV-tagged reply, this one looping HR into an assumption it hadn't approved a courtesy CC that functioned like a lever. I saved it. I didn't forward it. I watched the sender walk past my door and avoid looking in. Mid-afternoon, Mark called me into a small meeting room without windows and closed the door with unnecessary care. He spoke about optics and resilience and how transitions strain teams' words that sound empathetic until you hear them twice. I listened and nodded, asked one clarifying question about interim authority, and watched him answer around it. He mentioned timing without naming who said it, and the omission told me more than an admission would have. When he finished, he waited for reassurance. I gave him none. I thanked him for the update and stood ending the meeting by posture rather than argument, because arguments become stories, and I needed documents. In the hallway, Rachel passed with a folder tucked tight to her chest, the confidence a shade too practiced, and she said something kind that landed hollow because kindness without accountability is decoration. I wished her luck, and meant that luck wouldn't be enough. The EV thread aligned with the audio and access failures, and the sequence finally held. I sent Susan a concise note summarizing the linkage without adjectives, attached the archived emails, and flagged the access discrepancy Tom had mentioned, then closed my laptop to keep myself from adding anything unnecessary. As the day thinned, Tom confirmed that the badge system logged a change request routed around standard approval. Nothing accusatory, just data with a path, and I thanked him and said nothing else. The building shifted into evening mode lights, adjusting doors locking earlier, and I swiped my keycard one last time to exit, listening to the latch engage with finality. The door opened on time, and I knew authority was already waiting behind it. The USB drive waited inside a clear evidence bag on my desk, its edges catching the overhead light in a way that made it look clinical rather than dramatic, and that was exactly what I needed it to be. I didn't open it yet. I logged into my workstation and cleared my desktop closed, unrelated windows, and checked that my screen faced away from the corridor, because preparation reduces witnesses to the right kind. The drive had arrived through a channel that felt almost boring an accounting follow-up, a reconciled expense packet flagged for review. And boredom is how contradictions slip through without setting off alarms. I slit the bag, carefully slid the USB free, and set it down parallel to the keyboard alignment again, then plugged it in, and waited for the system to recognize it without comment. The file tree loaded cleanly. No flourish, no warning. Just folders named the way finance names things, when it expects no one to look closely. I opened the first spreadsheet and scanned totals rather than line items, because totals lie last, and felt the temperature in the room change as numbers settled into a shape that didn't match the story I'd been told. Vendor charges clustered where they shouldn't. Reimbursements aligned with dates that overlapped personal travel windows. A memo field referenced coverage without specifying for whom a word that sounded helpful until you mapped it to approvals that bypassed normal routing. I filtered by project code and watched entries drop away until only a thin column remained thin and damning. The masked account reference appeared once then, twice the app masking everything except the last digits. 47. A small detail that anchored the data to something real without shouting its name. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I copied the relevant sheets into a new folder and named it with a neutral tag that would blend in with audits, because blending keeps files alive long enough to matter. I cross-checked dates against my calendar memory, not times, just sequence, and the alignment tightened like a knot pulling itself closed. The expenses corresponded to periods when authority had shifted quietly, when approvals moved from my queue to someone else's, when access changes Tom had mentioned lined up with procurement shortcuts. The contradiction wasn't that money moved, it was how it moved through which hands and under whose assumed authority. I exported a PDF summary and placed it back on the drive, then ejected the USB and slid it back into the bag, resealing it, because custody matters when stories get loud. My phone buzzed with a message from Susan, asking if the financial angle was material yet. I replied with one sentence, "Yes, cleanly," and attached nothing, because attachments travel faster than context. A breathline steadied the moment the overhead lights stayed flat and honest. The USB's smooth casing reflected the glare, and I chose not to open the emails that would explain away what the numbers already said, because explanations are rehearsed and math is not. I stood and locked my office door, not secrecy containment, and carried the bag to a conference room where the table surface was scuffed from years of use imperfections that reminded me evidence doesn't need polish to work. I spread the documents out and took photos with my phone framing edges and headers, letting the masked digits, 47, sit naturally in view without emphasis. I didn't annotate. Annotation tells people what to see. I wanted them to arrive there themselves. Tom knocked once and stepped in keycard already in hand, as if to normalize his presence, and I briefed him on the discrepancy without adjectives, just sequence and system touchpoints. He nodded and confirmed that procurement approvals had been rerouted during the same window, a technical note delivered like weather. He pointed out a security wristband color change that coincided with the expense dates and operational detail that linked finance to access without anyone having to say the word intent. I thanked him and asked him to verify the logs, nothing more, and he left with the bag sealed again. Custody passing cleanly a chain without drama. I documented the handoff in a note to myself and saved it with the rest boring and precise. Back at my desk, Mark passed by and paused, his eyes flicking to the conference room, then back to me, a glance that asked a question he didn't dare phrase. I returned it with a neutral look and continued typing, because neutrality unsettles people who expect anger. Rachel crossed behind him with a stack of folders and laughed at something he said, the sound landing too brightly in a room that had begun to listen differently. I forwarded Susan a short summary of the financial contradiction, noting the masked account reference and the approval path shift, and asked her to coordinate next steps with operations. She replied within minutes, acknowledging receipt and confirming that the compliance officer would need to see this in a public context to avoid claims of internal bias. Public context. The phrase felt heavy and right. I packed the USB back into my bag and checked that the zipper caught, then sat for a moment with my hands still letting the math settle into certainty. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. The narrative had been that I was being replaced for efficiency. The numbers told a different story, one where efficiency was a costume and benefit hid underneath. I stood, adjusted my blazer, and walked the long way past the hall, where the stage lights warmed again, imagining how those numbers would look when projected large enough to force the room to stop clapping. As the day tilted toward evening, an email circulated announcing an all-hands update the following morning, mandatory agenda forthcoming, and I read it without reaction because I already knew what the agenda would need to be. I replied to nothing. I saved everything. The USB stayed zipped, the lights stayed bright. The building felt narrower, in a way that made exits clearer. The numbers collapsed the story, and the contradiction was too clean to ignore. The phone lay face up on the table, speaker mode, already on a choice I'd made before anyone else arrived, because control at the start saves explanations later, and when the room filled, I didn't reach for it again. Susan Keller took the chair to my left. Posture, neutral, legal pad closed, while Tom Reynolds stood near the door, with the calm of someone who manages thresholds rather than opinions. Across from us, Mark Hollis sat, two straight hands folded, and Rachel Evans chose a seat slightly back a distance that suggested caution without admitting fear. I began by stating sequence, not accusation, because sequence forces alignment whether people like it or not, and I slid the phone an inch forward so the microphone would catch every breath without making a show of it. The speaker icon glowed. The room quieted. I pressed one button. The voice on the line belonged to an internal auditor whose role had been ceded quietly days earlier, neutral, procedural, and she spoke as if reading whether confirming receipt of logs and noting discrepancies that required clarification. I said nothing. Susan said nothing. Mark cleared his throat once and stopped. The auditor referenced an internal incident log entry, page 4, as filed describing a change request routed outside standard approval, a routing that coincided with access modifications already acknowledged by operations. Tom nodded without speaking. The phone captured the nod anyway, a soft rustle of fabric, the kind of sound that later tells listeners who was in the room. Rachel's chair scraped as she adjusted a small sound that landed louder than it should have. The auditor asked for confirmation of who authorized the reroute. Silence answered first. Then Mark said it had been handled the same word he'd used before, and the auditor paused long enough for the pause to be heard. I leaned back and let the phone do its work. The auditor continued citing a log entry that recorded the timing of a badge permission change, no dates, just sequence relative to the public meeting, and asked operations to verify. Tom spoke then, voice even confirming the log, and noting that the request arrived with assumed authority attached. The phrase assumed authority hung in the room like a measurement. Rachel looked at Mark. Mark didn't look back. The auditor asked a follow-up precise about whether interim authority had been formally granted prior to the reroute. Mark answered around it. The phone caught the answer and the shape of what wasn't said. Susan finally spoke one sentence, clarifying that absence of formal grant mattered. The auditor acknowledged and moved on, asking for the documentation supporting the assumption. Mark said it would be provided. The phone hummed patient. A breath line steadied the space. The HVAC whispered evenly. The phone's glass reflected the overhead lights, and I chose not to interject because interjection would soften the edge that silence was sharpening. The auditor referenced the access log again, reading the entry aloud. Her tone unchanged, and asked if anyone disputed its accuracy. No one did. She asked if anyone wished to add context. Rachel inhaled, stopped, and shook her head. The auditor thanked the room and said she would escalate to compliance review pending receipt of documentation. She ended the call without ceremony. The speaker fell silent. I didn't turn the phone off yet. Silence can be evidence if you let it sit. Mark leaned forward and said this was getting out of hand, a phrase people use when control slips, and Susan replied that the process was finding its hands. Tom shifted to open the door, a fraction not inviting exit, reminding everyone where thresholds were. I slid the phone back toward me and ended speaker mode, the click clean and final, and the sound punctured the tension because it marked an end to something none of us would get to reframe. Rachel spoke then, carefully suggesting there had been misunderstandings, and I listened because misunderstandings leave trails when they're written down. She mentioned efficiency and continuity words that had carried her into the room and now struggled to leave it. Susan asked one clarifying question about benefit alignment and stopped. The question did the work. Mark's jaw tightened. The room felt smaller. The log read aloud, stripped intention from the room, and left sequence standing alone. I gathered the phone and stood not to leave, but to change the posture of the meeting, because standing shifts who must look up. I thanked the auditor aloud, though she was gone, a courtesy to the record, and said we would forward requested documentation through counsel. Mark nodded too quickly. Rachel watched the door. Tom stepped aside, opening space without ushering anyone out. I returned the phone to my bag and zipped it closed, the sound deliberate, and asked if there were any objections to pausing interim changes pending review. Susan waited. Tom waited. Rachel said nothing. Mark said it would be discussed. I nodded, acknowledging the non-answer as such. As we filed out, conversations didn't resume the way they usually do after tense meetings. People moved with care, measuring distance. In the corridor, a few staff looked up, and then back to their screens, sensing gravity without context. I walked past my desk without stopping, and into the hall where the stage lights were warming again for the all-hands announced earlier, and I felt the weight of timing settle into place. Susan matched my pace and said compliance would want public confirmation once documentation arrived, not to punish, but to prevent narrative drift. I agreed. Tom lingered long enough to say security would be present to manage flow, not optics, and I thanked him because managing flow keeps rooms honest. Back in my office, I placed the phone on the desk and took one photo of it resting there, screen dark, the time visible only as a reflection, then slid it back into my bag. I reviewed the folder where logs lived and added the auditor's call summary as received, not interpreted. My email chimed with a request from compliance for the USB and supporting documents to be presented at the all hands. I forwarded the message to Susan and confirmed availability. I did not reply to anyone else. The building shifted toward evening lights, adjusting doors locking earlier, and the quiet carried a different tone, now less avoidance, more attention. I packed my bag and paused with my hand on the handle, thinking about the public scene ahead, about how the phone on speaker had changed the room without raising a voice, about how authority listens when it hears itself recorded. I straightened my blazer and turned off the lamp, letting the office fall into shadow, while the hall stayed bright, and I felt the calm that comes when decisions are no longer theoretical. The call closed the circle, and the next truth would have witnesses. The lobby lights were already at full brightness when I stepped onto the stage edge, the time-stamped CCTV still frozen on the large screen behind the glass podium, its clarity unforgiving, the kind that leaves nowhere for interpretation to hide. Security wristbands flashed at the entrances as people filed in, the soft rustle of fabric and programs settling into a hush that felt heavier than applause ever had. Tom Reynolds stood just off to the side, earpiece in posture-neutral, managing flow without drawing attention, and Susan Keller took a seat in the front row with a folder closed on her lap, the posture of someone ready but not eager. Mark Hollis stood near the podium, hands clasped, rehearsed calm, cracking at the edges, as eyes flicked from the screen to his face and back again. Rachel Evans hovered a step behind him, shoulders squared, gaze fixed on the floor, her badge catching the light and giving it back too brightly. I waited for the room to finish arriving because arrivals shape memory, and then I nodded to Tom. He dimmed the house lights just enough to force focus forward. I didn't speak at first. I let the image work. The CCTV still showed the lobby angle from earlier in the week, the timestamp clear, the sequence undeniable, the moment when access changed hands captured without commentary. Phones lifted instinctively, then lowered, as people realized there was nothing to add, nothing to interpret, only to see. I felt the glass podium cool under my palms as I stepped forward and said only that compliance had requested a brief clarification before moving on a phrase that sounded routine enough to lower defenses. Susan stood and introduced herself, and the compliance officer seated at the aisle, already present, already watching. The officer nodded once and asked Mark to confirm the timing of the access change relative to the public meeting. Mark answered, voice steady until it wasn't, and the hesitation landed audibly in the room, a crack that traveled faster than words. A murmur rippled when the officer asked for confirmation of interim authority, and none came, the still image glowing brighter, as if reacting to the question. Rachel shifted the scrape of her shoe loud in the quiet, and I saw a few heads turn toward her before returning to the screen, instinct choosing evidence over people. The officer thanked Mark and asked operations to verify the log, and Tom stepped forward just enough to be seen, his confirmation brief, procedural, final. The timestamp on the screen anchored his words, the order of events locking into place as the room recalibrated what it thought it knew. Someone in the back whispered a name. Someone else shushed them. The building's HVAC hummed evenly, indifferent to reputations. A breath line steadied me. The bright stage light erased shadows. The glass podium reflected faces I recognized, and I held my composure because control at this moment mattered more than vindication. Susan asked permission to submit supporting documentation, and the compliance officer agreed, eyes never leaving the screen. A uniformed authority figure stepped into view at the side entrance badge, catching the light presence unmistakable without a word, and the room shifted again, this time toward gravity. Mark's shoulders dropped a fraction. Rachel looked up finally and met the image behind her, seeing herself reflected in a moment she hadn't planned to share. The officer announced a temporary pause on the transition pending review, effective immediately, and the word immediately cut through the space like a clean edge. I stepped back, letting the process take the foreground, and watched as security adjusted positions, not to intimidate, but to hold shape to keep exits clear and conversations contained. Phones rose again, this time to capture the badge, the officer's stance, and then lowered, as people realized this wasn't a clip for later commentary, but a record being made now. Mark attempted to speak and stopped when the officer raised a hand, the gesture small and absolute. Susan nodded once at me, not triumph confirmation. Tom met my eye and looked away, his job done. The image remained on the screen until the officer asked for it to be saved to the record, and then it faded to black, the after image lingering in the room longer than the light had. The CCTV froze the timeline in public, and authorities stepped forward without raising its voice. I felt the floor steady beneath my shoes as the room exhaled the kind of exhale that follows clarity rather than relief, and I knew the script had finally lost control of the stage. The hard copy notice letter lay centered on the conference table, its weight final in a way email never is. The paper thick enough to resist casual handling, and I waited until everyone was seated before I touched it, because sequence still mattered even now. Susan Keller sat to my right, composed, while the compliance officer reviewed notes without looking up, and Tom Reynolds stood near the door as he always did, when outcomes needed clean exits. Mark Hollis arrived last, eyes rimmed red, in a way that suggested sleep had been interrupted by consequence. And Rachel Evans did not arrive at all, a choice that spoke louder than presence would have. I slid the letter forward and opened it flat, the header crisp, the language precise, and read only the operative paragraph aloud, because excess explanation dilutes authority. The words confirmed a temporary reversal of the transition, an immediate suspension of interim authority, and a formal review of process breaches. Nothing dramatic, nothing kind, just correction. Mark listened with his hands folded and nodded at the wrong moments, habit persisting after relevance had thinned. And when I finished, he asked if there was room for discussion. Susan answered that the discussion window had closed with the public record, a sentence delivered without heat, that landed with more force than anger ever could. The compliance officer added that documentation would be finalized and circulated, and that any further communication would be routed through counsel, a phrase that quiets rooms because it replaces personality with process. I felt the table's cool edge under my palms and allowed myself the smallest release of tension, not celebration, acknowledgement that the work had moved from proving to executing. The notice letter stayed open, its lines visible, its authority borrowed from systems that had finally noticed themselves being used. A breath line carried the moment the room's light softened, now that the crisis had passed. The paper rustled faintly as the officer gathered copies, and I let my shoulders drop, because posture had been doing too much work for too long. Mark cleared his throat and said he regretted how things had unfolded. A statement shaped to sound human without admitting cause, and I nodded, because nodding acknowledges sound without endorsing meaning. Tom opened the door, and the corridor noise slipped in, ordinary again, people moving with purpose that no longer revolved around a single stage. Susan collected the letter and handed me a copy for my records, the gesture, careful, respectful final. Outside the room, staff paused as we passed, eyes flicking to the envelope now tucked under my arm, and I returned their looks evenly, not victorious, not wounded, just present. Someone asked if things were okay, and I said yes, because okay now meant accurate, not safe. In my office, I placed the notice letter in the same neutral folder as everything else, and closed it, the zipper's sound less sharp than it had been days ago. I forwarded the compliance summary to myself and archived it, building a record that would never need drama to explain itself. My phone buzzed with a message from my husband asking if we could talk. I didn't answer yet. The legal payoff had landed, the personal one could wait. By afternoon, an email went out to the division clarifying leadership continuity and reaffirming oversight protocols language that reset expectations without naming names, and I read it once and closed it, because I didn't need validation from phrasing anymore. Tom stopped by to confirm access had been restored according to policy and that any changes would now require dual approval. I thanked him and meant it. Susan sent a brief note confirming next steps and wished me steadiness, a word that felt earned. I replied with thanks and nothing else. I gathered my things slowly, not because there was more to do, but because pace had been my ally, and I wasn't ready to abandon it. The hall lights glowed softer now, no longer accusatory, just functional, and I walked through them without feeling exposed. At the exit, I paused and looked back once, not to memorialize the fight, but to register that the room had returned to scale, that no one person filled it anymore. I stepped outside and breathed air that didn't belong to the building, feeling the notice letter's presence in my bag, like a settled weight rather than a compass. The letter closed the case, and the work returned to its proper size. I stand at the glass podium after the room empties present again, where the story began, and the surface is cool beneath my palms, transparent enough to show nothing hiding behind it, solid enough to hold weight without comment. The lights are on, but gentler now. Not the interrogating brightness of exposure, just functional clarity. And the building sounds return to their baseline hum as chairs are stacked and doors close in an order that makes sense. I breathe without counting. I don't need to scan exits. The podium reflects my face faintly, not distorted, not flattering. Simply accurate, and accuracy feels like rest. People pass in the corridor and nod the way they do when a room has settled. Not celebratory, not wary, just acknowledging that work resumed where it belongs. I gather my notes and slide them into my bag without organizing them again, because order has been restored enough to trust itself. I think about the sequence as it now exists, not as it hurt, and the difference matters. The public announcement sits where it should, bracketed by process instead of pretending to be one. The notice letter rests in a file that won't be revisited unless someone decides to repeat a mistake, and I know how to spot repetition now, because patterns announce themselves once you've watched them break. My phone stays silent, and I let it, because silence can be chosen after it has done its work. I step down from the stage edge and feel the floor give the slightest feedback, a reminder that movement still meets resistance, and that's healthy. Tom's voice carries faintly from the side hall, coordinating a lockup with the ease of someone who enjoys systems behaving. And I'm grateful for people who keep rooms honest without needing applause. A breath line steadies the end. The lights soften to evening mode, the glass edge cools my fingertips, and I accept the calm without reaching to explain it, because explanations are for moments that haven't resolved yet. I walk the length of the hall once more, not to check anything but to mark the distance between then and now, and it's shorter than I expected. The screen is dark. The projector is silent. The podium waits for whoever needs it next, and that neutrality feels earned rather than imposed. I pass the exit doors and pause, listening to the latch engage and disengage as security finishes up, and the sound no longer anchors fear, just closure. Outside, the air is cooler and smells like rain that hasn't arrived, and the city carries on at a scale that makes office drama feel appropriately small. I don't replay conversations. I don't draft messages in my head. I consider my husband's text again and decide to answer later, because timing still matters, and some conversations deserve a room that isn't charged. I walk a block before turning back toward the station, feeling my shoulders settle into a posture that isn't performing anything. 8 years of work don't vanish because someone tried to rename them, and they don't need defending once the record stands. I have a job to do tomorrow that looks a lot like the one I did before, minus the noise, plus a clarity I didn't know I could trust. At home, I set my bag down and place the notice letter in a drawer that closes softly, the paper no longer a compass, just a reference point if needed. I make tea and let it cool while I stand at the window, watching lights blink on in other buildings, each one a small stage with its own rules. I think about how easily authority borrows confidence from tools, and how tools behave better when someone notices. I think about the woman who stood beside my husband, and how her ambition wasn't the crime, only the shortcut was, and how shortcuts always demand payment eventually. I think about my own silence, and how it wasn't weakness, Just timing, and timing proved to be the sharpest instrument I had. I drink the tea. I answer one message with a simple acknowledgement and leave the rest for morning. I lay out clothes without deciding which ones matter more, because choice doesn't feel urgent anymore. The night settles into a quiet that doesn't ask anything of me, and I allow that. When I turn off the light, the reflection in the dark glass looks like me again. Not a version bracing for impact, just a person standing where she stands. The light stays on, and I walk forward unafraid.